Haha, I did it. I'm so evil I clickbaited you again. While I will be discussing which entries to the Xeno series are quote-unquote canon or not, the main topic of the video is not going to be anything regarding which games are actually connected to each other, but instead, what specific media entries are canon to each individual Xeno continuity. Xenogears and Xenosaga are old and inaccessible, so I will not be spoiling them as well, but we're in the neat little corridor of Xenoblade X Definitive Edition coming out soon, and me not wanting to spoil that game either for the purposes of people who are going to play it for the first time soon. So, that means, once again, I can say, this video will contain spoilers for the entire numbered Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy. Before that, though, yeah, we do probably have to talk about which games are canon to each other, because people will get very annoyed if I don't at least touch on it once. I hope I don't need to explain in detail again why all the trilogy Xenoblade games are connected to each other, and why Xenogears is not and will never be directly connected to any of the others, but there are a few things regarding Xenosaga and Xenoblade X's connections to the trilogy that I do want to talk about now. Firstly, regarding Saga, I think I have never really articulated my opinion on its connections as well as I should have. I think that Saga is going to be connected to the numbered Blade games, but technically that connection has not been fully made yet. All the Future Redeemed stuff happened, but I'm of the opinion that there are a few background details from Saga's lore that need to be either recontextualized, expanded upon, or retconned in order for the two continuities to fit together perfectly, or at least in the way I expect they're going to fit them together, which is to make Xenosaga's Earth and Klaus's Earth the same one. Technically speaking then, those universes are not tied together yet because all of the versions of Xenosaga that currently exist were made prior to Xenoblade. I'm saying Xenoblade as the entire series here and not just Future Redeemed, purely because all of the Xenoblade games reference Saga in a few ways that give a lot of hints that seem to imply the cosmology of the Xenoblade universe is the same or very similar to Saga's, but it wasn't until Future Redeemed where it seems like, no, these might actually be the same universe. Basically, the way I'm treating it is that events very, very similar to the existing Xenosaga games that can be best represented by footage from the existing Xenosaga games exists in and around the Xenoblade games as we know them, and those nebulous events will just be replaced with the events of the updated Xenosaga re-release, if and hopefully when that eventually happens. Now, regarding Xenoblade X, yeah, it is connected to the numbered trilogy, just not in the way people think it connects after Future Redeemed, where, again, like with the Saga thing I said, the Earths are the same. That is not true. However, at least since Xenoblade 1's Definitive Edition was released, it seems like it was within the minds of the developers and writers that they were in the same multiverse. And honestly, this probably does go back to Xenoblade 2 in 2017. First, we need to go to Chapter 10 of Xenoblade 2, when Klaus is talking about the conduit and its power and all that. He says, "Our world was not the only one. Endless universes coexist side by side, yet all completely unaware of one another. The conduit was our link to these foreign worlds." So yeah, a Xenoblade multiverse was confirmed to exist as far back as Xenoblade 2. But why do I know as a fact X is included in it? Well, in order to celebrate the release of Xenoblade 1 Definitive Edition in 2020, series executive director Tetsuya Takahashi did a bunch of interviews. One of them was with the website VG247.com, and one of the questions in that interview was, on this topic, there's some curious small game connecting changes in Definitive Edition, like Alvis's necklace being changed to reference Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Is your intent behind changes like this just a nod and a wink to fans, or are these attempts to more deeply and more obviously connect the universes of the games? Do you want to draw these universes closer together? Takahashi's response: from the beginning, each entry in the Xenoblade Chronicles series has depicted a single episode within the flow of a larger time and space. So they are, at their roots, closely connected with each other, but we're flexible with changing the means and ways in which we depict this in each entry. Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles 2 are like two sides of the same coin, which might be why it feels like the connection between them seems to be particularly standing out. Keep in mind, this was a post-Xenoblade 1DE interview, 2 years before Xenoblade 3 came out, which means Takahashi was not talking about it at this time. And yet, he discusses the series as if 1 and 2 are not the only entries, which means X was definitely also included in all of that he was talking about, which more or less is confirming that, yes, X does exist in the same multiverse that was explicitly mentioned in Xenoblade 2. Now, I've talked about this stuff since 2020, and all of this only became controversial after Future Redeemed came out, when people took the face interpretation of all of that as the connection is different than we've been directly led to believe, but I never extrapolated it any further than that. Klaus says there are endless universes that exist side by side, which means that it is incomplete to say that Xenoblade X is in the same multiverse as the numbered games. It is more correct to say that every save file of Xenoblade X is in the same multiverse as the numbered games. My saved file, where I created a character and played through a certain way, that's one universe. Your saved file, where you created a completely different character and played through a completely different way, that is another universe, all connected to the others by the conduit and perhaps other relics like it. The probably tens and thousands of people who, when playing the original game in 2015, did the most boring thing possible and made their character as close a copy of Shulk as they could, each one of those is a different universe connected by the conduit. And this obviously goes further than X. If there's truly an infinite amount of universes, then there won't just be infinite universes that are permutations of Xenoblade X, there are infinite universes that are permutations of every other game in the series. So, do you prefer the Wii version of Xenoblade 1 to Definitive Edition? That's just another universe in the multiverse. It's less connected to the others because it's probably not tied to a conduit, but it could be reached if someone had one and wanted to. Do you have a big headcanon or fanfiction story that goes outside the scope or fundamentally changes things from the story of the games as they exist? That is another universe. There is a universe for every change, big and small. It's not unreasonable to say that there are alternate universes where legally distinct versions of Xenogears and Xenosaga happened that are explicitly canon, though not closely connected to the Xenoblade games. You could probably reasonably say that Monolith's other games are in the same multiverse because of how broad this description is. Baten Kaitos? Sure. Disaster Day of Crisis? That's just an alternate take on Earth being in danger at the beginning of Xenoblade X. Namco Cross Capcom and the two Project Cross Zone games are in continuity with each other, and if you make the very simple assumption that the Fiora in Cross Zone 2 is at least an alternate version of the Fiora from Xenoblade 1 or Xenoblade DE, then all of those IPs are in there as well, and you could probably use a similar argument to bring Smash in the mix too. There is an alternate universe for everything, and because we know the multiverse works that way, it is connected. There is a version of the Xenoblade trilogy where literally everything is the same as we know, except Rex's name is Judo Ashita and Nia is blue. And that is completely canon, we just haven't seen it in any official Xenoblade media. Basically, there is a canon universe out there where the Earth of Xenoblade X and Klaus's Earth are the same one, it's just not the reality depicted in any existing Xenoblade games that you can actually play. Now though, with that probably too long diversion out of the way, let's talk about what we're here for. What other pieces of media are canon to each Xeno game? To make things really simple, we're going to start with the numbered Xenoblade trilogy, because that is, for all intents and purposes, the one with the least supplemental stuff to talk about. Firstly, there are 6 video games in this continuity: Xenoblade Definitive Edition, Xenoblade 2, Xenoblade 3, Future Connected, Torn of the Golden Country, and Future Redeemed. There are other versions of the original Xenoblade game, and you can effectively substitute any pre-2020 version of Xenoblade 1 for its definitive edition, but if we're being a stickler for flashbacks in Xenoblade 3, it is specifically the DE version of Xenoblade 1 that's canon to that game, which would make all the versions with the original art style nearly identical, but technically still distinct AUs. All 3 of the main games have an art book associated with them, but the majority of the content in those books is not what I would call canon to that game. And that's because those art books are not lore bibles including things that didn't make it into the final game. they're books primarily based on concept art, or brainstorming ideas for the final game, which means, basically, if something isn't directly reflected in the final game, but appears in a concept art section of one of the art books, you can't really consider it canon. Xenoblade 2's All Rest Record book is pretty much entirely concept art and reprinted dialogue from the game itself. So there's not really any new canon information in there, besides design details on characters, because a character's concept art for their final design might have details that didn't make it onto their model in-game, but because it's their final design, it would still be canon. And I guess you could throw the height chart in there as well. But the art books for 1 and 3 have a little bit more in them. Xenoblade 3 Ionios Moments is also mostly art, but it does have a little bit more than Xenoblade 2's book does. And that is developer interviews. Most of the content of those interviews are about approaching things from a character design or game design perspective, so nothing story-based, but there is an interview with Tetsuya Takahashi and the game's director Ko Kojima that answers questions submitted by fans prior to the book's release. Some of the answers to the questions, like Lands being a machina or Logos being present in End's Sword of the End, are things that are able to be figured out from Xenoblade 3 and Future Redeemed themselves, but there is some new information, ranging from confirming that Riku's father is Riki when it could have theoretically also been Kino, to completely new things like the idea of Fiora's soul being in Lucky 7, and a proper explanation of how Ionios avatars work. It's not a lot of new content, but it is new official canon information. Xenoblade 1's art book, The Secret File Monado Archives, is also mostly concept art, but in addition to being an art book, it was also somewhat of a fan kit, so it contained answers to surveys, some interviews with developers, and the character bios among all of the art are the most detailed of the 3 books, some of them even containing a little bit more information about the characters than could be directly gleaned from the game itself. On top of that, there's also a 5-page short story based on cut content from the original game that details an off-screen set of party interactions prior to the final battle, and as far as we can tell, is explicitly canon. Lastly, there's a timeline of events of Bionis and Mechanis that details the history of Xenoblade 1's world in a more objective manner than any character's description in the game itself does, and in doing so provides a few more details and relative dates than could be gleaned directly from the game, and as such is also new canon information. The last thing we need to discuss for the numbered Xenoblade trilogy is our old friend, the Back of the Artifice Siren model kit, because that provides a lot more detail about Klaus's Earth than anything else in the series really does. And while I guess you could technically argue that because it's not in a video game it's not canon, everything in it was backed up by the way the world is depicted in Future Redeemed as well, so I think we can pretty safely say this is the last piece of canon information for the numbered series, at least so far. Next we move on to Xenoblade X, and here's where things get kind of interesting, not just because of the upcoming definitive edition, but also because of X's art book. The Xenoblade X Secret File Art of Mira book arguably contains more story information than any of the art books for the numbered trilogy, but we can't really count that as new canon information, because all of this is stuff from a scrapped previous plot. And we're not about to call the scrapped plotline from Xenoblade 1 about Rein turning evil and using time travel canon just because it was in the Monado secret file, right? While we will later see situations where information in a book like this is just fully canon stuff that was cut for time constraints, it's impossible to say what in the Xenoblade X art book is stuff that was cut for that reason, or stuff that hit the cutting room floor long before the final version of the story was finalized. Remember, there was a version of Xenoblade X's story that was a fully single-player game with a discrete non-avatar protagonist, and that character might not be canon at all, or he might have been reworked to a certain character seen in the original game who will be expanded on in Definitive Edition. We don't know yet. There is some stuff from the art book that is being fully canonized and brought into game form in Definitive Edition, but we can't say whether or not that stuff is canon pre-DE coming out because we don't know if that stuff already existed on the periphery of the original game, or if it's being reworked from the versions we see in the art book into something that can fit into the final version of Xenoblade X. That being said though, I did not say that the game is the only source of Xenoblade X content. If you were to go to the official Japanese website for the original Wii U version of Xenoblade X from 2015, you would find a special section. It contains a short article about a Tatsu plushie inspecting an unpainted prototype for the Formula Skell model kit, which did eventually get made and is getting reissued to celebrate DE, but more importantly, it contains 2 short stories of 5 chapters each that are fully canon prequels to Xenoblade X. The first story is called Forging Blade. It's told in third person. The first chapter follows Tatsu and details a misadventure he had that leads to the situation we find him in the story of the game. The other 4 chapters follow the trio of higher-ups in NLA, but primarily Nagi, and detail the initial actions of humanity after crashing on Mira, up to the formation of Blade as an organization itself, and it ends not too long before Elma's mission that leads her to find us at the beginning of the game. The second story is called 24-Hour Happy People, and is in first person from the POV of Lynn. It details her adventures trying to improve the food supply in NLA, a lot of conversations about tacos. There's a character named Tony who doesn't appear in the final game, who might be a Xenosaga reference, I'm not even entirely sure. And it also confirms that there is an Irish pub somewhere in NLA that is just called Finnegan's Wake, which is absolutely hilarious. Anyway, these stories were only on the Japanese website, but fan translations for everything except the final chapter of 24-Hour Happy People exist and will be linked in the description, and I am hoping that in the lead up to DE, translated versions of these will be published on various international Nintendo sites, because they're genuinely pretty good stories. Now though, it's time to move into the realm of the older Xeno games, where a lot of the people watching this video might just not know much about them in general. I'm going to start with Xenogears because Saga gets a little weird and complicated, and this is at least a bit more straightforward. Gears was the original Xeno game, and because the more things change, the more things stay the same, it is the one that initially started the trend of art books containing additional lore details. And I think even if you're not super familiar with Xenogears, you've heard the term perfect works before. That art book is, I would say, closest to the Monado Secret Files out of any of the other ones from the series. However, it contains way more information, also having its own canon short story, this time written by Xenosaga about the background of the character Ramses, and functions as more or less a lore bible in addition to an archive of concept art and having some developer interviews. There's timelines, there's explanations of the power system, how the mechs work, elements of the world's history that aren't in the final game, and on pretty much every page of concept art for a character or mech, there's a little blurb explaining details, some of which aren't in the game. Now, we don't know how much of this material was intended to be in the original game and just got cut for time constraints, or how much of it was stuff the writers decided on or had to come up with in order to flesh out the world while they were creating it, and decided not to include it even in the initial expanded plans for Xenogears. It is worth mentioning that this is where the big Perfect Works 6 episodes timeline comes from, that explains how there would be more entries in the series if Xenogears became a series, and perhaps some of this information had been created in the anticipation that they might get another entry in the series and be able to explain that more here, but either way, virtually everything in Perfect Works is canon. There are a few pages of comedic illustrations of various characters, as well as a couple pages of concept art for upgrades to characters' mechs that didn't make it into the final game, but those are directly signposted as rough draft, and the blurbs there even say, we initially intended for these upgrades to make it in, but they didn't. So only that stuff that's very obviously not canon is non-canon, and everything else is either a clarification, an expansion, or a full explanation for something that was present in Xenogears as we knew it. And that's why people hold Perfect Works in so much regard, because ultimately it gives Xenogears the deepest and most granular lore out of any entry in the series. All of that being said, Perfect Works is not the only piece of Xenogears print media, as there were 2 separate manga volumes as well. The first is called Xenogears Comics Anthology, and contains a few pieces of colored art, as well as 15 different manga chapters, some of which are pure comedy, some of which are more serious, and some of which are somewhere in between. Now, the thing about this is, some of these are probably canon and some of them aren't. All of the fully serious ones not only line up exactly with the game in Perfect Works as is, but also are actual expansions on characters, their thought processes, and their personalities. For example, there's an extremely good chapter about Myong, and the very first chapter, which is about Sigurd's past, was written and drawn by Soraya Saga herself, so at the very least, I think we can consider that chapter fully canon. As for the more humorous chapters, some of them do straight up break the plot by having characters interact with each other in ways they never would in canon, or just have events happen out of order. So like, the one about Faye and Ellie stuck on the oil rig is completely non-canon, and the one about the elements and Ramses is probably also non-canon because of how nonchalantly Graf just shows up there. And then there's also one other chapter that is explicitly stylized as using the characters from Xenogears to act out a different story, which is where this comes from. On top of that, though, there are a few of the comedic chapters that don't break the plot in any way, and are more or less written similar to the serious ones. Either something that happened before or after the game, or events that happened during the plot that we just didn't get to see in the game itself. And those ones also tend to be within the comedic tone that more comedic scenes in the actual game of Xenogears have. So I think those can still be considered canon. Like, Bart and Billy going on a stupid misadventure trying to find cake ingredients is something that absolutely could happen in the game, it just doesn't, as far as we could tell. So I think it's fairly reasonable to say that at least some chapters in this anthology are canon, and the only ones that aren't are ones that have some sort of glaring contradiction, because all of the ones that have a tonal clash with the game itself also have some sort of character or story contradiction as well, and even the goofier ones that don't have those are within the tones of the game. The second volume is a bit different, and that is because it is a 4-koma anthology, each composed of a bunch of different chapters with different authors and artists. And this is an almost exclusively comedic volume, and it's also way more meta than the other anthology is, as many of the gags in the strips derive from characters being self-aware of the fact that they're in an RPG, or making fun of game mechanics or abstractions therefrom, as well as a lot of instances of taking an actual serious scene from the game and putting a comedic subversion on it, so I think we can safely say that this one is a lot less canon than the other one is. The only thing is, this is where a lot of pieces of fan-favorite characterization comes from, like Bart asking Faye out multiple times and Fujoshi Ellie, and I'm not about to tell people to stop believing in that, so you could also view it as a thing where this is a weird AU where everything that happens is much sillier and everyone's self-aware, but the characterization and character traits themselves are things that are accurate to the main canon versions of those characters. Or something like that, I guess. Lastly, though, we arrive at Xenosaga, and I'm going to do my best to ease us into the complicated parts. The first thing, I think, is everyone is aware that the original trilogy of PS2 games are completely canon. I don't know if you knew this, but Xenosaga 2 is a direct sequel to Xenosaga 1. I'm really blowing people's minds here with this video, I'm sure. But there are also 2 other entries that are vital important parts of the Xenosaga experience, and are both best experienced in between episodes 2 and 3. Both of them were never localized, and are not officially accessible even in their original Japanese right now, but do both have very accessible fan translations that are fairly comprehensive. The first is the mobile phone game Xenosaga Pied Piper, which is a prequel focusing on the backstory of the character Ziggy in a way that does tie into the overarching plot of the entire series. And the second is the original web visual novel, I guess is the best way to describe it, Xenosaga A Missing Year, which explains a big incident surrounding Xion and Cosmos that explains some things that happened during the time skip in between episodes 2 and 3, and sort of acts as a how did we get here when we see Xion in a completely different situation at the beginning of the third game. Not only do the events of both of these fit within the events of the main trilogy without contradicting anything, but both are directly referred to in Episode 3, and the entries in the in-game lore database for Episode 3 confirm that the events happen exactly as described in those entries, so Pied Piper and Missing Year are both 100% canon. Next would be, of course, the obligatory art book discussion, but that's not actually where the next piece of information comes from, as instead of there being a full Xenosaga art book, the Tetsuya Takahashi interview explaining more lore details was in the Xenosaga Episode 3 Perfect Guide guidebook. And while, as far as I know, a full fan translation of the book does not exist, there is a very good fan translation specifically of that section, and the 45 questions and explanations present therein, which give a lot more expansion on the cosmology, universe, and history of Xenosaga, and the way it's described is actually consistent with how the cosmology of the Xenoblade, at least numbered trilogy, is described, which has led me to believe for a while now that even if they never decide to connect Xenosaga and numbered Xenoblade, the cosmologies themselves are similar or the same. Next, though, we have to move on to something that no other Xeno game can really boast, and that is adaptations. As Xenosaga Episode 1 not only has the anime adaptation, but also a 3-volume manga adaptation. And you can probably already guess where I'm going with this. These are adaptations. They are alternative takes on the original story presented in the video game, and as such are non-canon. While the manga is significantly closer to the game than the anime is, it still makes some cuts, and the anime completely reshuffles events, including an entire plotline for Jin who barely appears in Episode 1, as well as just straight up including a new character, so that can't be considered a retelling of the same story. You might be able to argue that the manga is an alternative telling of the game itself, but I think because it never got sequels telling Episodes 2 and 3, and does make some changes, we have to call it more of an AU retelling as opposed to a retelling of the game's events directly. As for other pieces of multimedia about Xenosaga 1, there are the 3 drama CDs known as Xenosaga Outer File 01, 02, and 03. These were released in between Episodes 1 and 2, and do appear to be canon supplemental information. It provides a backstory to Matthews and the crew of the Elsa, is the first introduction of the characters Richard and Herman to the series, as well as expanding a little bit on events during Episode 1 itself. Some parts of the CDs even straight up taking audio from cutscenes in the original game and using it as context, set dressing, or straight up expanding on it. Xenosaga Freaks, on the other hand, is kind of very non-canon. It was also released as a supplemental thing in between Episodes 1 and 2, and while it does contain a puzzle game, a demo for Episode 2, and a complete republication of Episode 1's lore database, the main draw is probably the character stories, which are VN text adventure routes based on a bunch of main characters from Xenosaga 1, and the tone of these is just so out there and over the top that it doesn't match the tone of even humorous scenes from any of the main Xenosaga games whatsoever, so I think we could just kind of say it's non-canon entirely. It doesn't really even line up timeline-wise either. Like, it is written as if everything in Episode 1 has happened, but the cast is all in their Episode 1 designs on the Elsa, and the Durandal is in the state the Durandal is in at the end of Episode 1, even though the first non-flashback scene in Episode 2 takes place maybe 5 minutes after the ending of 1, so there's no real place to shove this in either. Oh, this is also where the running gag of Cosmos being a cat girl comes from. That's something that was carried on in basically every crossover appearance she makes, including subtly in her Xenoblade 2 design, except instead of her just acting like a cat sometimes, her and Momo just literally turn into cat girls, which I'm fairly certain is something that completely breaks the lore of Xenosaga anyway, so there's another reason for this not to be canon. Our last PS2 entry to talk about is Xenosaga Episode 1 Reloaded, which, if I had to give a one-sentence description, would be more or less Xenosaga 1 Final Mix, but describing it that way implies that there were a lot more changes made than actually were. It came with a bunch of bug fixes and a trailer for Episode 2, but the main change is that This is a Japanese region version of Xenosaga 1 that uses the English dub. And in fact, it is just the English dub, and there is no option to use the original Japanese voices. There are also 2 new outfits, one for Cosmos and one for Momo, as well as the addition of a cutscene viewer. It is already fairly well known that the first predecessor to the Xenoblade series, Event Theater, was in the Saga games, but most people thought it originated from Episode 3 and not this 2003 re-release of Episode 1, which is kind of neat. Lastly though, we need to discuss Xenosaga 1 and 2 for the Nintendo DS. This was a 2006 combined remake, demake, rewriting, whatever, of the first 2 Xenosaga games for that system, released only a few months before Episode 3 ended the series. This game makes several changes to the story of Episode 1 and especially Episode 2, introducing some characters earlier, changing the way certain events play out, and including a couple new minor characters, including just straight up a brand new guest party member from the opening Acephalon sequence of Episode 1. There's also a side story system, and some of the shuffled around story events are relegated to this. As one example, when Shion and Alan are rescued by the Elsa, Ziggy and Momo are actually already there, and you can later unlock the small story segment from the original game where you play as Ziggy to rescue Momo and eventually escape to the Elsa as one of those side stories that explains more or less everything that was in the original game in that section. In addition to many main game cutscenes being expanded upon or changed, for example, there's an added section of a conversation between Ziggy and Shion where he references his past from Pied Piper. There are some side stories that also include brand new content, some focusing on characters that you wouldn't really expect. There are a couple about Shion, obviously, but then Alan has one detailing his POV of certain elements that you mostly see from Shion's. Hammer has one for some reason, because Xenosaga Hammer is everyone's favorite character, obviously. And there's even a side story about a brand new Realian character who's only introduced in this remake's version of Episode 1. The thing about all of this is that while there are changes, they do not contradict any of the background establishing lore that was presented in the original versions of 1 and 2, and the way the world and characters end up with at the end of this DS version is the same as the end of the original PS2 version of Episode 2. So, despite things being expanded upon and some things being changed, Xenosaga 3 is a sequel to not just the PS2 versions of Episodes 1 and 2, but also to Xenosaga DS. So, which one of these is canon? Probably both of them, honestly. While there are some direct changes and contradictions in the DS game compared to the original versions, most of those changes are in service of outright adding new content to the game, and again, both the PS2 and DS versions end up in the same place at the end. Remember, the DS version came out roughly 4 years after the original Episode 1 and roughly 2 years after the original Episode 2, and so close to Episode 3 that it's likely all of the rewrites were done with hindsight of the first 2 games and knowledge of what was going to be done in Episode 3 in mind, which means that it probably lines up better with how they decided to end the series than the original versions of the game did. Keep in mind the amount of games the Xenosaga series had, and the amount of the original storyline that got included in each game changed multiple times throughout the development of the series. So when the original versions of Episode 1 and 2 were written, the writers did not know how much more Xenosaga there was going to be, and how much time and money they would have to make those games. So the DS version is likely an update to the events of the original games that does not directly contradict or replace the overarching events of them, but more closely lines up with the ending of the series they ended up having to go with. The way I view this specific case is that both are canon, and you can choose whichever one to include in your own personal headcanon of the Xenosaga series. Either the PlayStation 2 versions of Xenosaga Episode 1 and 2, or the DS game is followed up by Pied Piper, Missing Year, and Xenosaga 3 to make the entire canon Xenosaga series, also throwing in the events of Outer File and the extra contextualization and lore details from the Xenosaga 3 Perfect Guide. That being said, I do view the DS script as the most up-to-date version of episodes 1 and 2, and I'm fairly certain that if the Xenosaga series is ever to get a full-on remake, episodes 1 and 2 in that are going to be based on the DS versions and not the PS2 ones, albeit with 3D choreography probably drawn from the PS2 games for any scenes that are the same between the two of them. But yeah, that's the entire Xeno series and what's canon to it, at least as of now. We're already going to have a new version of Xenoblade X that appears to be adding new stuff to the base game in addition to an epilogue not too long from now, so we're going to have a lot more to talk about pretty soon, even if it doesn't connect to anything. So look forward to that, and until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.